Epstein came across my radar in about 2011, and I ultimately went down to Florida in 2012 and started digging into Epstein. And that's when I acquired his Black Book. And I brought the Black Book back to New York City, and I tried to get publishers to publish it and let me write an article about it. And it took me 3 years before I could get someone to publish it and let me write articles about it. It was, and that was Gawker, which has unfortunately been sued into oblivion at this point. But it's interesting. There was a grand jury in Florida that found that Epstein hadn't molested a single child. And the Palm Beach Police Department, which initiated the investigation into Jeffrey Epstein, had 5 victims, underage victims, that they had statements from. And then they had people that corroborated the victims, but they knew of 17 more victims. So the Florida law enforcement and the judiciary knew of 23 Epstein victims at that point. But that grand jury only called 1 Epstein victim. And that special prosecutor, Barry Kushner, skewered her. So that grand jury didn't find Epstein guilty of a single count of child abuse. And the corruption has just cascaded since then.
What you're describing, I would consider myself to be a sane person, is absolutely mind-bending.
It's mind-bending, and but what's truly unfortunate is that you've got the federal government covering up child trafficking, both in the Franklin scandal and also in the Epstein scandal. The U.S. attorney for the Southern District of Florida was Alexander Acosta, and that's who was ostensibly supposed to prosecute Epstein. He had a list of 32 Epstein victims. I have that list. And he did not charge Jeffrey Epstein with 1 count of child abuse. And after he had been U.S. attorney, he was nominated to be Trump's labor secretary. And he was being vetted by the Trump administration. And they asked him, why didn't you go after Epstein? And he said, I was told that Epstein was intelligence and that it was above my pay grade and to leave it alone. So you have in the Epstein case, you have a U.S. attorney standing down from prosecuting child abuse when he has a list of 32 victims. Now, here's where it gets really mind-boggling. Constitutionally, there's only 2 people in the government that can tell a U.S. attorney to stand down. One is the president and one is the attorney general. That message can be delivered by a minion of the president or the attorney general, but only one of 2 people can tell a U.S. attorney to stand down. So that's the kind of power that was deployed to make sure that Jeffrey Epstein wasn't indicted by the feds. And Alexander Acosta has been questioned about what he had said to the Trump administration, vetting him about that Epstein was, that he'd been told that Epstein was intelligence, and he's never denied that at all.
Do you remember the first time you came across Epstein's name in your research when you were looking into these type of behaviors?
It was about 2011, I believe. And I'd spent 7 years investigating and writing the Franklin scandal, and I went as deep into a child trafficking network as someone can go. I mean, I got to one of the blackmail photographers, and I got to other people that were definitely privy to the intelligence connection and the hidden cameras. And then I found a number of victims. I had that grand jury that covered up the abuse in Omaha, Nebraska, that indicted those 2 kids. They had a list of 60 victims, and I got all the grand jury documentation. So I had a list of those 60 victims. And there were a lot more victims, but there was a state investigator that had found 60 victims. And my job was to find those victims. And unfortunately, and we see this with the Epstein case too, Um, Unfortunately, a lot of those kids came from very dysfunctional backgrounds,
Yeah.
and then they were repeatedly molested, and the carrot was drugs. And if they performed, they were given drugs. And then at a certain point, they would be expunged. And we saw this with the Epstein network too. At a certain point, they would be expunged because they would lose their youthful marketability. And then what you have is a severely dysfunctional young adult that oftentimes goes on to commit crimes so they can feed their addiction and thereby end up in prison or end up as felons or in some way compromise their own credibility. So it's almost a perfect system that you take these kids and really damage them, and then they will eventually go on to compromise their own credibility.
Well, I would imagine in your research that you came across a variety of names. What was it about Epstein that drew your attention and more scrutiny?
The cover up with the grand jury. That was a telltale sign. Um, I, I've written a lot about children's issues. I started writing about children's issues in 1990. I mean, I've written about a lot of different things. I've had a freelance writing career that spanned like 30 years, but I've written a lot about children's issues, and actually I wrote a book about I co-authored a book about lower socioeconomic children that was published in 1995. So I'm sensitive to children's issues, and then once I saw what was happening in the Franklin scandal, where these kids were getting trafficked, and then I came across other people that came to me. When you write a book like that, you become kind of like a lightning rod, and a number of people had come to me and talked about being trafficked and could I investigate. And I'm just one guy. I really felt bad that I couldn't investigate all the allegations that came to me. But the thing that stuck out about Epstein was I felt that there were major legal aberrations that occurred in Florida. And I can remember going down there, and I'd spent 7 years on the Franklin scandal, and I didn't really want to investigate another network. I really didn't. But at that point, the media was just depicting Epstein as a lone pedophile. But then when I managed to acquire his black book, there's scores of victims in the black book as well as power brokers. And I started calling victims. And they were telling me about being flown around and also about the island. And I realized he was running a network, a very big network. And as disheartening as it was, and I knew that this was going to be very difficult for me because the Franklin scandal had been very difficult for me, and people didn't want to listen to me. And I knew that Epstein was going to be difficult. But on my first trip to Florida, I acquired the black book, and I thought, well, here is the black book. Publishers are going to take note of this. I'm not just pitching them conjecture. I've got Epstein's black book that has scores of victims as well as a lot of power brokers. And people, I live in the mecca of publishing, New York City, and no one in New York City wanted to touch it until Gawker. And it took me 3 years to get it published. But when I started to call those victims, I knew that I was dealing with another large network. And actually, the network in the Franklin scandal, I think it was a larger network than Epstein's, but it had been around for, as I said, 10 to 12 years. Whereas I think Epstein had trafficked children for about 25 years. It wasn't as big. It was big, but it wasn't as big as the Franklin network, but it was around at least twice as long as the Franklin network.
Your book, about the black book came out in 2015.
Yes.
And it seems like, mainstream media initially wanted nothing to do with it. He wasn't even arrested until 2019.
Well, actually, even before, he was arrested in 2008 initially.
I was going to say, I think I have it in my notes as 2006 for sex crimes against a minor in Florida.
That's when the initial investigation started with the Palm Beach Police Department.
Yeah, my point is that it's not as if this was unknown. I, as a, again, somebody considers myself to be a reasonable person, I don't understand with the volume of data and the history of behavior with this individual why this was not frontline news or headline news across the United States.
Well, it made it into the mainstream media prolifically. Every mainstream media outlet in this country has talked about the Black Book. Everyone.
Yeah.
Um, but none of them have really talked about the Black Book the way that the Black Book should be talked about. And only one publication has given me credit for putting the Black Book on the internet. You would think that when this stuff started to come out about Epstein and people realized what a resource the Black Book was, that my phone would be ringing off the hook, but there were no calls. Vanity Fair called me. That was the only publication that called me.
Well, it would seem as if they probably, many of those organizations likely reported on it because they felt like they had to, and maybe to the minimum amount, as opposed to feeling like they wanted to and really diving into what it could mean for the power structure that exists in the United States.
Yeah, Americans are very naive about their political system, and it's truly unfortunate. I've been looking at, I wrote another book. I teamed up with someone who ran a gay escort service in Washington, D.C., and we wrote a book called Confessions of a D.C. Madam, The Politics of Sex, Lies, and Blackmail. And the intelligence would use his gay escorts to compromise closeted politicians. So I've been looking at this for quite some time. And Americans have a collective naivete about their political system. They do not think that their politicians are being blackmailed, which is truly unfortunate, because I've come to believe that the checks and balances within our government is blackmail. Our politicians, when you get to the national level, they're either blackmailed and or they were willing to make Faustian pacts. And when I ultimately caught up with a blackmail photographer when I was researching the Franklin scandal, and I can prove that he was a blackmail photographer, I have police reports on him. I said, how does this work? Because I was still investigating, and I was still trying to get my mind around it. And he said, it's like you're on a yacht, and it's a beautiful yacht, and it's a beautiful day. And you can have anything on this yacht that you want. But if you decide to get off the yacht, the people on the yacht are going to make sure that you drown. And our politicians are on the yacht. And there's zero incentive for them to come out and say that they're being blackmailed.